Hey everyone, Demonite here. The topic of this video is damage modifiers of enemies in Borderlands 2 and TPS, such as level-based damage reduction, elemental resistances and weaknesses, or damage type specific resistances like grenade damage resistance. Let's begin with level-based damage reduction, something everyone who played over power levels in Borderlands 2 is familiar with. As soon as an enemy is 2 or more levels above your own level, you will deal less damage to that enemy. Here you can see the complete list of all damage reduction values for any level difference. As you can see, it's not a linear increase, and there are 18 different reduction values before it stops increasing once an enemy is 19 levels or more above your level, at which point you will only deal 1% of your damage to it. The most important value here is probably the 65% at 10 levels above, since that's what you usually get at OP10, but keep in mind that not every enemy has the same level, so this isn't a static value. Bosses in particular tend to have higher levels, resulting in higher damage reduction, with some enemies even reaching the 99% reduction, like for example the Iron God. Friendly AI, such as Exton's Saber Turret or Wilhelm's Wolf and Saint, completely bypass level-based damage reduction, so they will deal the same damage no matter what level the enemy is. Damage over time effects are affected by level-based damage reduction. Furthermore, status effects cannot be applied to enemies that are 6 or more levels above your own level, unless you are playing Borderlands 2 and are at least level 73. This is because of overpower levels, since with those you will of course always be underleveled, and not being able to slag enemies in that case would be quite game breaking. It starts at level 73 because that used to be OP1 before the Commander Lilith DLC increased the level cap to 80. I suppose they didn't bother raising the level for this exception when Gearbox made that DLC, so now the game still thinks you're doing OP levels once you reach 73 and you can apply status effects freely, even if you're joining a game that is at OP 10 where the enemies will be level 90. Moving on to elemental multipliers. Different elemental damage types have different multipliers for each health type, being flesh, armor and shields. Probably not something I need to go over in detail, so here's just the elemental table with all the values. However, besides these base values, certain enemies can have modified or additional multipliers for specific elements. For example, snowmen in the Mercenary Day DLC don't receive plus 75% damage from incendiary, but plus 100% instead. Various skeleton enemies, on the other hand, have an additional incendiary modifier that reduces the damage you deal. Technically, skeletons are still flesh enemies and you deal plus 75% damage against them, but in addition to that, some of them have another modifier of minus 75%, which is multiplicative. With both values taken into consideration, you'll only end up dealing 43.75% of your incendiary damage to those skeletons. So even though they have the flesh health type, incendiary damage would be a bad choice. A little fun fact, one of the skeleton types that do not possess this negative modifier are skeleton mages, so be sure to light those SOBs on fire. Anyway, there are loads of different enemies with negative modifiers like that for any type of element. Some are pretty obvious, like a shock enemy with a resistance to shock damage, but others aren't, like power loaders with an additional minus 75% incendiary damage on top of their usual minus 60% from being armored, which equals a total of minus 90%. Furthermore, sometimes specific body parts of enemies have changed elemental multipliers. You might be familiar with armored psychos, which are weak to corrosive and resistant to incendiary on their bodies, but their heads are actually treated like flesh, and as such you deal 75% more incendiary damage, but 40% less corrosive damage when critting them. The eyes of constructors and most loaders have their regular elemental multipliers removed. This means that in the case of a constructor, every element deals the same damage to its eye. In the case of a power loader, the regular multipliers are gone, but its additional incendiary resistance of minus 75% does still apply. Note that it needs to be a critical hit with a bullet in these cases. If you're hitting them with something that can't crit, it won't count as hitting their eyes. A few enemies, including constructors, can also be critted with TDR reloads, but the damage multipliers get all weird and inconsistent with those, so that's a different topic for another video. Now, some body parts are rather weird too. For example, the flying head of Jacques O'Lantern leaves a smoke trail behind it that has its own hitbox without any elemental multipliers. And wouldn't you know it, Jacques too has messy interactions with TDO reloads and splash damage. It's also important to note that all of these modifiers are innate to the enemy and completely separate from your own elemental damage buffs. Equipping a relic with bonus elemental damage will of course not change the values enemies have, it will just raise the damage you deal before enemy multipliers are applied. Besides elemental damage modifiers, there are also modifiers based on different damage types, like melee damage or grenade damage. For example, a lot of skeletons receive 1.5 times the damage of your melee attacks, while Crystalisks receive 10 times the melee damage and crystal skeletons receive 30 times the melee damage. As for grenade damage, there are enemies with a resistance to it. It's something I've mentioned before on my channel, and you probably know it from certain bosses like Saturn or a few raid bosses which can't be killed quickly using TDO reloads. But it turns out that there are actually two separate types of resistances at play, the other being splash damage resistance. Grenade damage resistance is fairly simple, it applies to everything that deals grenade damage. So that's grenades, most TDO reloads, certain weapons with splash damage, and some other things. Splash damage resistance on the other hand affects everything that deals grenade damage, but also launcher splash damage. However, gun splash damage, like from a Maliwan sniper, is unaffected. Certain enemies have these resistances, either innately or when specific conditions are met. For example, a constructor has 75% grenade damage resistance by default, but when it puts up its shield it gains an additional 20% splash damage resistance. So if you throw a grenade at that constructor, the damage would be reduced by 75% and then reduced by another 20%, resulting in a total of 80% damage reduction. Splash damage resistance in particular seems to favor enemies that have some kind of bullet reflection, like constructors while their shields are active, power loaders while their hands are spinning, bull loaders, spider ants, skeletons with shields, and so on. But bullet reflection is a mechanic that I will save for another day, because it's very inconsistent and has a bunch of weird interactions with splash damage, damage over time effects, and guns with penetration, so it deserves its own video. Anyway, there are some niche but still noteworthy interactions between certain enemies and splash damage. Some enemies have body parts that consist of separate entities, like the turrets on Saturn or badass constructors. Those turrets don't possess grenade or splash damage resistance, and if you damage them, then a percentage of the damage dealt will also be dealt to their host, except for damage over time effects. In the case of Saturn and constructors, it's 65%. The damage the host will suffer is determined by your base damage, meaning the damage you deal before enemy multipliers. So if the turret is lagged, that doesn't boost the damage on the host, unfortunately. Similarly, if the host has different elemental multipliers than the turret, like for example EOS, who can have a shield while his turret is armored, then only the multipliers of the host will apply to the damage it receives. The same thing goes for other types of damage reduction, including grenade damage resistance. However, in the case of splash resistance, for example when a badass constructor puts up its shield, the resistance will not be applied to the host when you damage the turret. Now this doesn't mean the splash resistance is disabled or anything, just that the percentage of damage that's transferred to the host won't be reduced further by its resistance. So if you shoot a rocket at a constructor's turret while its shield is up, the damage directly dealt to the constructor will be reduced, but the damage transferred from the turret won't be. Admittedly, this isn't that big of a deal, since badass constructors only gain 16.67% splash resistance from their shield, but it is a neat fun fact. Now, as you have seen, if you damage both the turret and the host with an attack, the host will essentially receive bonus damage. Let's take Saturn as an example. You get an additional 65% for every turret, and hitting all 4 of them at the same time will deal a massive 360% damage with a single hit. This also makes stuff like Bore or Chain Reaction extra juicy. Of course, if the turrets die, you can no longer do that, so there is a limit. Ideally, you want to achieve a lot of overkill damage on the final hit on a turret, and you also don't want to slag them to prevent them from dying early. Fortunately, the turrets can't be death-marked, so you don't have to worry about that. Moving on to companions. For them, grenade and splash resistances still have an effect, but I'm not completely sure how they're calculated. I didn't do a whole lot of tests in that regard, and I only did them with Axton's turret, but from what I can tell, the resistances are much more forgiving for companions. For example, Saturn or Badass constructors only reduce the damage of the turret's rockets by about 54.7%, and when the constructor puts up its shield, that doesn't even change. Another example are power loaders, where the rockets only deal 9.2% less damage by default and 20.5% less while their hands are spinning. Now finally, some enemies just have a universal reduction of damage, for example the warrior. All types of damage are reduced against him. On his body it's a 75% reduction, on his chest pieces it's 60%, and on his 2 crit spots it's 65%. These values apply to almost all damage types I tested, so gun damage, skill damage, shield damage and melee damage. For splash damage and TDO reloads the values vary. Grenade and launcher splash get reduced by 55% on his entire body no matter where you hit. Gun splash is always reduced by 75% instead, also independent of where you hit him. And TDO reloads are just inconsistent again. There are also some enemies, or rather one specific type of enemy that's just kinda weird, being Crystalisks. They have a bunch of funky mechanics, but a particularly odd one is their complete immunity to certain types of damage. Gun splash damage in any form can't damage them at all. The same is true for shield damage and a lot of skills, like for example Maya's Cloud Kill, Zero's Death Blossom and many more. And that is all about damage resistance of enemies. I don't think I could ever make a complete list of all enemies with unique damage multipliers, but I have started making a list of enemies with grenade and splash damage resistance. I will link to it in the description below, but it's not complete yet, as I obviously haven't tested every single enemy in both games. If you know of any that are not listed already, let me know and I will add them. And if there will be any additional information regarding this topic in the future, for example when it comes to TDO reloads or friendly AI, then I'll also write that in the document. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching and see ya everyone.